it is good to see each one of you here this morning. We are blessed to be able to get together. And I want to say a welcome to the Menominee and Hudson families that I understand are also joining us today for this service. We have a lot to be thankful for. If you think about it, just sitting here today with the health that we have, even though we're inconvenienced with masks and a bunch of other things, we are blessed to be here today. And I'm very thankful. What a year. What a year. You know, some people, I've heard someone say this is the longest 4 years in 2020. You know, it seems like a long time, doesn't it? But it's just been a few months, really. But God has sustained us. God has blessed us. God is still in control. I read a quote. Someone identified this, said, the best quote of 2020, and I can't argue with it. It says, this is not the year to get everything you want. This is the year to appreciate everything you have. What a perspective. Isn't that neat? We are to appreciate what we have, not be grumbling about what we don't have. We have so much that God has blessed us with. And I'm extremely thankful. I want to talk this morning about something I don't completely understand, but I believe in. I believe wholeheartedly in it, and I am convinced of it, even though I don't understand it. And that is prayer. I don't understand it completely, but I believe it is a biblical teaching, something that we ought to be learning about and practicing, because prayer is the connection that we have with heaven. Oh, if you get into a discussion about prayer, you can have all kinds of lively discussions about prayer. How it works. Does it work for everybody? Does it not work for some? Do we have to have a certain level of faith for it to work in your life? And what if it is not the answer that you want? Does prayer work? You know, I've heard someone say that God answers prayers in 3 ways. Yes, no, and you've got to be kidding. Let's turn in the Bibles to James chapter 5. James chapter 5, in a verse that is a challenging verse for us to start out with. James chapter 5, and we read verse 16. James 5:16 says, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Do you believe it? Do we really believe it? Do we stake our life on it? Is it something we believe that strongly about? Does it work? And what is it? James gives evidence in his mind, evidence of how prayer works. And we look at it in the next few verses there in verse 18. After saying it avails much, he says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. And according to Elijah, that is evidence, according to James, that is evidence that prayer works. You remember the story. Elijah had been given a message of God to go and speak to King Ahab and said, it's not going to rain until I tell you it's going to rain. And the rain dried up. Spring rain came, it didn't come. The fall came, and the fall rains didn't come. And the next year was the same way. The rain didn't come and didn't come and didn't come. Now Elijah ran and hid in God's direction, and God provided for him during those 3.5 years. And then at one point, Elijah meets up with a servant of King Ahab and says, tell Ahab to meet me on the top of Mount Carmel for a showdown. They got there to Mount Carmel, and the arrangement was that the prophets of Baal would be able to pray for rain. So they set up their altar. They put their sticks on it. They put the sacrifice on it. They were told no flame, no fire. You cannot put any fire on it. It will be the God that answers by fire. That is the true God. And the prophets of Baal did everything they could do to try to persuade their God to send down the fire. And it got to the point that Elijah was actually poking fun at them because it wasn't working. And then in the afternoon, late afternoon, Elijah said, it's my time. Rebuilt the altar, put the sticks on top, put the sacrifice on top, and then dug a trench around the altar. And I don't know where they got the water, but they went and got water and poured it over the sacrifice, over the sticks, over the altar, down into the trench, and filled the trench with water. And then Elijah just prayed a simple prayer. Fire came down from heaven, destroyed or burned up the altar, the sacrifice, the wood, and the water. Completely. And then Elijah went off and he prayed. And he prayed 7 times. And it rained. This is James's evidence that prayer works. But what happens if it doesn't work for me? Now, we have an interesting story in the book of Acts, chapter 12. And I invite you to turn there because we're going to spend probably most of our time in Acts chapter 12. And as a bit of an introduction to the story, we find that this is during the time where there's a lot of persecution of the early Christian church. Herod is trying to destroy Christianity, and he goes and finds James, one of the disciples, and he kills him, and he finds out that makes the Jewish leaders happy. So he says, well, I've got to do something more. And so he gets Peter and puts him in prison. They're going to have a mockery of a trial because he wants to kill him as well. And as I read that, I thought to myself, how would my faith in prayer be? How would my faith in God be if I knew that my neighboring pastor in the neighboring district had been killed and my pastor was put in prison with the idea that he was going to be killed? And I prayed, would he answer my prayer? Is God still in control? Let's look at verse 5 and following. It says, Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer. Well, he was arrested, put in prison, had a whole 16 soldiers that escorted him to prison and then locked him up and watched him very carefully. It says, therefore, Peter was kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out that night, Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, arise quickly, and his chains fell off. Then the angel said to him, gird yourselves and tie on your sandals, and so he did. And he said to him, put on your garments and follow me. So he went out and followed him, and did not know what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they were past the first and second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. And when Peter had come to himself, he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish leaders. Quite a story. Think about it for a minute. The angel gets into that prison, and I just like it, knocks Peter on the side. He woke him up. And Peter's there chained, and the chains fall off. And the angel, realizing that Peter's still half asleep, says, okay, you need to put your sandals on, you need to put your robe on, it's time to follow me. Let's go. And they go right past the guards who are guarding but not seeing them. Goes past the next set of guards who is guarding them but not seeing them. It goes out, and the gate opens out, They are outside in the city, and suddenly the angel disappears, and Peter realizes he's on the street, and this is not a dream. As we read further, we find that Peter decides he needs to go someplace. I mean, this is not the best place to be in the middle of the night, out on the street by himself. And so he goes to a friend's house, to the house of John Mark. And I wonder why he went there. And I'm going to do just a little imagining for a moment. He went there because they were praying for him. But I can almost imagine that some of those people that have been praying for their pastor, Peter, had gone to the guards and said, I want to go and visit my pastor in prison. Can I go visit him? I want to talk with him. I want to pray with him. And the guards may have let them in. They went in there and they had prayer with him. And they said, just remember, Peter, we're praying for you. We're praying for you. And I can only imagine that's probably one of the reasons Peter went to John Mark's house, because he knew people were praying for him. He knocks on the door of the outer gate, and a girl named Rhoda comes to the gate. Let's read verse 14, chapter 12. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where they were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked on the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. We sometimes laugh at Rhoda for not letting Peter in. But think about it. Rhoda had probably been inside that prayer meeting. And suddenly she recognizes the answer to their prayer is on the outside of that gate. And she's excited. And in her childish or immature way, she's so excited, she runs back and tells the people that are praying, Peter is outside. Verse 15 is probably the most disturbing verse of this whole story. But they said to her, you are beside yourself. And she kept insisting that it was so, and they said, it is his angel. Think about that for a second. They were more ready to believe that it was his angel than it was really Peter. What do you think about that? Think it through for a moment. These faithful people had been praying for Peter's release. And yet when Peter was released, they would not believe it. They didn't only fail to believe it, they refused to believe it. And I have to ask myself the question, what were they expecting? Were they expecting their prayer to be answered? Were they expecting only that their prayers were more of an exercise of faith rather than that their request was being made to the King of the universe, who has all power to do anything? And it makes me ask myself the question, when I pray and I ask God what I would call a big ask, do I really believe that God is listening? Do I really believe that God not only can, but will answer my prayer? I wonder if we would have a whole different outlook if God was to pull back the curtain and we were to be able to see what was going on. We get in our cars and we drive someplace, and before we drive, we often will pray, God, protect me today. We're driving down the highway, it's the middle of winter. Could it be that an angel goes ahead of you and dries up that icy spot on the highway so you don't spin out of control and get in an accident? Do we sometimes fail to recognize that God is working on our behalf when we pray? God is doing things for us when we pray, even when we cannot see it. There's a story in the Bible that tells us that indeed the curtain can be pulled back because we have Elisha in the city of Dothan, who is the object of the Syrian army's anger, and they want to capture him because he's telling the Israelite king the secrets of the Syrian king. And the Syrian king realizes he needs to get rid of this guy who's the informant. So they go and they surround the little city of Dothan to try to get Elisha. And as Elisha's servant gets up in the morning, he climbs up the stairs to the roof of his house and to exercise or to stretch or whatever, and he looks over the walls of the city, and there is a whole army of the Syrians. He recognizes their banners. These are not friendlies. These are the enemy. And he runs back downstairs and he tells Elijah, "What should we do?" And Elijah said, "Let's go back upstairs." And they go back upstairs. They get up there, and he looks around, and Elisha does see the Syrian army. But then he says, "Lord, open his eyes." And God opens his eyes, pulls back that curtain, and that servant also is able to see a second army. And the way I picture it is there's the army of the Syrians all around facing in, and there's the army of God all facing out. They are there to protect Elisha. Oh, that's a fascinating story if we were to spend more time with that this morning. But God can pull back the curtain, and we can know that there are things going on when we pray that we cannot see, but God is at work. And I'm afraid that often we fail to recognize God's providence because we are not expecting God's providence. When we ask for wisdom and the words to say in a crucial conversation, and when we get done with that conversation, we say to ourselves, "Well, that went well." Do we say, "Well, I guess I'm smarter than I thought I was"? Or do we say, "God, thank you so much for giving me the right words to say"? When we go to the doctor for an illness, or we pray for somebody to get well and they get well, do we immediately turn our thoughts and our praise to God, or would we say, "Man, the doctors are pretty good"? Well, I'm not downing any medical staff, don't get me wrong. But God is the one who ultimately brings healing. And he is the one, when we call on him, he does and he will answer our prayers. I believe it is important to recognize that when we pray, God is at work. God does miracles on our behalf, whether we see them or not. He works miracles on our behalf. A number of years ago, I was a student missionary in Korea, taught in an English language school, and part of that involved doing some evangelistic meetings, and right there in the school, and a lot of our students would come, and most of the people of Korea are Buddhist, not Christians. But we'd have people come, and a lot of them came because they wanted to practice their English, which is okay. But they would come, and I would speak in English, and we'd have our pastor translate into Korean. And I preached that series, and one of the students who also came to the meetings was a young lady, collegiate age young lady named Miss Kim. They all went by last names there, Miss Kim. She was a university student, and you could recognize that. She had the white blouse and the black skirts. That's what they wore there for the university. And she was coming, and she was making some good decisions. She had made a decision to be baptized. This was near the end of the series, and we had learned from her that she wanted to be baptized, but her parents were very much against it. Very much against it. And she was struggling with that decision. Well, it was the Friday night next to last night of the meetings. And on Sabbath, we were going to have a baptism, and she was going to be baptized. And I had seen her come in. She was at the meeting, but yet when I got up to speak, she was not in the meeting. And it wasn't until I was done that I walked up to the back, and one of the student missionaries said, Miss Kim is up on the roof. It's a flat roof. It's a patio up there, so it's not like this. She was up there. And so I went up there to talk with her, and she was scared because her parents had said they would disown her. And that's very significant in the Korean culture. And she was scared to be baptized. Make her stand for Jesus. We prayed together. And then we went downstairs, and I got involved in different things and went back to the house, which was part of the same compound right there at the school. A few minutes later, there was a banging on the outer gate of the compound there, and went to the gate, and here's a young middle school-age boy with a stack of books and a watch and a pair of glasses all covered with blood. And he didn't speak very good English, and he really struggled, but he finally gave us the information that Miss Kim and George, who was a student missionary, had been hit by a car and were headed to the hospital. So the other two student missionaries and myself, we got a taxi and headed up to the hospital, and when we got there, hospitals are different there than they are here. We were able to just walk right into the emergency room. And over on one side, in a big room, over on one side here was George, and a medical staff was taking care of him. He'd hit the windshield. They were pedestrians. He'd hit the windshield, had cuts that were being stitched up, and Miss Kim was kind of in the middle of the room on a gurney, and all covered with blood as well. And I went over there, and she was kind of in and out of consciousness. And I took her by the hand. We prayed together. And then she said, I know why I'm here. She said, because God is angry at me because I'm scared to be baptized. And I tried to assure her that it wasn't God who was angry, it was Satan who was angry. He did not want her to be baptized, and he was trying to find ways to destroy her, to make her not follow through on her commitment. George was able to come home that night. Miss Kim stayed in the hospital for a number of weeks. And again, hospital's different there than here. In every hospital room, there's a patient bed and a caregiver bed. And her mother was coming. Whoever the caregiver is, they not only change their clothes, they also bring them food. And so the medical staff basically do the medical procedures, and the caregiver does everything else. Well, Miss Kim's mother was there. She stayed with Miss Kim during the times that she was in the hospital. And through that time, we would go and visit her, and we got in conversation through Miss Kim because the mother spoke no English. But we got in conversation with her, and over the next days, God blessed, and we were able to tear down some of those hostile feelings to Miss Kim becoming a Christian. Unfortunately, in my mind, for us, we had to leave Korea at the end of our term and came back to the States after that week was over. But I understand that Miss Kim did become a Seventh-day Adventist. God blessed her. And I think to myself, prayer, we prayed for safety. The accident happened, but God saw something bigger. He understood that we needed to have that interaction with the mother. I could not have drawn it up that way. I would not have drawn it up that way, but God saw a bigger picture. And I think sometimes we fail to grasp that God always knows best. In his wisdom, he sees the bigger picture. And in his wisdom, he always chooses the best way for us. And when we pray, we are really giving ourselves into God's care. And our prayer ought to be, Lord, do with me whatever you see is best. Help me to be a tool used for you. But Lord, use me, and may I give myself completely to you. You know, Peter was delivered from prison that night. Paul and Silas also were delivered from prison by an earthquake. But if you read the stories of the early Christian church, there were many who didn't get delivered from prison. Many died for their faith. They died in dungeons or in arenas, still trusting God. Still trusting in a God who can deliver as he chooses. We read stories of Daniel in the lion's den, how he was delivered, of the 3 Hebrews who were cool in a hot fire, of David who ran and was protected from an angry King Saul. And these are stories that should build our faith that God indeed can do anything. It is not limited by anything. I would encourage you to read the book of Job. You have wonderment about God. You think about it, that really the book of Job is quite a bit of an argument between God and Job, and between Job and his friends. God is trying to illustrate to the universe, including us, of his power and his ability to protect and to bring out the best in the long term. And Job doesn't understand that. His friends don't understand that. But God is trying to portray a picture. And if you look at the last few chapters of the book of Job, it is fascinating. Job chapter 40, after in chapters 38 and 39, that God has told about how powerful he is, how he can do everything. Job in chapter 40, verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you?" Job realized the power, the significance, the bigness of God, and he felt like he was about this tall in God's sight. God, you are amazing. You can do everything. I have no arguments against you that stand up. But again, in the rest of the book of, the rest of the chapter of chapter 40, God then challenges Job again, reminds Job of his power to control. Nothing's beyond his power. And in Job chapter 42, verse 1, then Job answered the Lord and said, "I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you." What a statement of faith. What a statement of faith. You can do everything, and nothing is beyond your control. You know, when we realize that, when we really realize that, our prayers are different, aren't they? That God can do everything. He sees that bigger picture. You know, Jesus reminded his disciples that, he sees the lilies of the field, and he sees the birds of the air, and he cares more for us than he does for them. He sees the sparrow when it falls, and he says, you are much more valued than they are. One night, they were out on a pitching boat in the Sea of Galilee. Storm had come up, and the disciples were there, and they were experienced fishermen. They were scared to death that they were going to drown. They had forgot that Jesus was in the back of the boat. And then they prayed. Then they remembered Jesus was in the back of the boat, and they prayed. Now, the prayer was not a very sophisticated prayer. It was, "Jesus, do you not care that we're perishing?" You know, sometimes that's all prayer we can do too. Lord, I need your help, and I need it now. Jesus heard that prayer of desperation, and he stilled the sea, and he stilled their hearts. And he can do the same for us. If we give ourselves in prayer to Jesus and say, "I am yours. Take me and use me. Make me the person you want me to be. Guide me and help me. Let me be the witness for you." We should be amazed but never surprised at what God will do. We may be amazed at how he does it and what he does, but we should never be surprised that God acts on our behalf. Because the same God who delivered Daniel from the lions and saved the disciples in the boat, released Peter from prison, is still alive and well today, and will answer the prayers of those who come to him. I would encourage you and challenge you to look at prayer as more than an exercise of a Christian, but as direct communication with the Creator of the universe, who longs to hear our cry. Whether our cry is that of joy or that of fear or that of hurt, he longs to hear our cry. And he can do what is best for us today and every day. And I'm happy to be able to say that there is nothing too difficult for God. To put it another way, there is nothing too difficult for God. And I'm thankful that there is nothing too difficult for God. And I just encourage you to place your trust in God, because he is always with us. Let's sing our closing hymn, number 528, Shelter in a Time of Storm.